I'll do a demonstration and then I will explain how things work. First of all, we'll spawn in a couple of drones and then I will tell them to gather these resources. So they will go at the resources, gather that, return, and then repeat that task. But what if I wanted to build a mine, for example? I go over here, I can place some mines, but they're not being built. That's because if I open this menu down here, they have been assigned to this group by default, and their highest priority is to gather. So in order to get them to build, I would need to click this, and I can drag it up, and if I put it at the top, then once they're done with the previous task, they'll go and build. And then because there's no building tasks, they will go back to gathering. So now these mines are producing resources, but they need a drone to go and pick up those resources and haul them back to the base here. So to do that, I could just drag this haul back to the top and then they will prioritize those tasks. Alternatively, I can create a new group and give this haulings the priority, and then I can spawn some more drones, and those drones are automatically going to the haul tasks because those are the only tasks that are available. But if I want them to only do those tasks, I can move them into this group. I can also stop them from doing any other tasks as well by right-clicking on these, and that will disable those tasks so they will never do those. And then if I ever wanted to get rid of this group, I can simply close it and the drones will go into the unassigned pool where they won't do any tasks because they've got nothing assigned. But then I can assign this group and then they will continue to do tasks. So now I'll go into how these systems were implemented. Start off with the UI. The first thing I did was make custom buttons. This is partially because I needed to implement drag and drop functionality, but I also wanted the buttons to be visually consistent as well. So to implement the drag and drop functionality, I rode the on preview mouse button down. It checks if it's a left mouse button. I also implemented an interface for this so that the buttons could be generic. They didn't have to be tied to any specific parent widget. So this calls the left click of the interface, then detects if a drag event occurs. I did initially use the built-in Unreal drag system for this, but I found that it was very limited and did not work well for what I needed it to do. So I ended up developing my own drag and drop system. So if a drag does occur, then it calls this onDrag detected function, and then that will again use the interface to call the drag started event. And lastly in here in the event graph, on mouse enter, which is when a mouse enters a button, in this case it's calling the move button interface event. And now if we move on to the priorities menu, so this is the individual task groups for the drones. The first thing this does is it takes all of the buttons that are currently in the widget and adds them to an array. The event drag here is what's called from the onDragged event in the button. The button itself is then actually hidden, and a preview widget is created, which is just an empty widget that acts as if the button is being dragged. We then have this event move button, which is called when the mouse is dragged over a button. This actually checks if this button is within this widget, and it does that so that if I have multiple of these groups, I can move this within this widget, but then if I move it over here, it doesn't affect these buttons. And then it takes button being dragged and the button that was dragged over and swaps them in the array. It then clears the buttons that are in the vertical box and then puts the buttons back into the vertical box in the correct order. So this gives the illusion that they're being swapped when the button is dragged over the other buttons. Then we have drag ended, which just makes is dragging set to false, and then this sets the position of the button that is being dragged. And when the drag is ended, it then removes the preview widget from the parent and makes the button visible again. And lastly, for the drag functionality, I used the mouse button up event in the player HUD. This is because I wanted to be able to drag outside of this box, and then if you release anywhere within the UI, it will register the mouse button has been released. If I did this in one of these other widgets, it would only register if the mouse button was released within that widget. So now I'll go over how the task system works. So these set the gather type variable, and then when the left mouse button's clicked, and then we have a switch on the gather type, and that determines which of these is called. For now, I'll just go over what happens when it's a gather task. So you have to go over to the game mode, and whenever a task is added, regardless of the type, this is the event that's called. And then it takes the arrays of the different tasks, and depending on which task type was input, it will add the task to that array. Now we move on to this new task event. This is called by drones whenever they are spawned and whenever they complete their previous task. They are added to this idle drones array, and then on tick the game mode will check the idle drones in the array and will see if there are any tasks available for them. So it will check the array of tasks that the drone has, and it will check each of them in order to see if there are any tasks available for that particular task type. And then if it does find a task, it will break it, and then it will set the task within the drone and remove the drones from the idle list. And it will also remove the task from the available tasks, which basically just does the same as the add function but removes instead. So when the set task function is called within the drone, that then gets the drone to set the task variable, and it also then gives itself a gameplay tag of gather, haul or build. This is so that in the behavior tree of the drone, it will trigger one of these three branches, and these branches all work somewhat similarly. Basically, they run an EQS query around the resource, moves the drone to that location, triggers an event within the drone, and then just resets the location that needs to be moved to. This one is slightly more complicated, but it's basically the same thing. This first one is to move it to a resource, then this will trigger the gather resource event until the drone is full of resources, and once the storage full gameplay tag is on the drone, it will switch over to this branch and then do the same thing but go to the drop off location instead, and then start removing resources till it's empty, and then it will go back to this branch. And then lastly, the gather works identically to the haul function. And the last thing I'll mention is that in the drone, when it completes a task, whether that's hauling, gathering or building, it will request a new task from the game mode, but with gathering it will actually add a new task itself before removing it, so it will keep repeating that task if it has the priority set